The second question from the Essential Dialogue Network is that based on the insights shared in the Circle of Seven interview and your paper on the fourth person perspective, could you provide advice on the key points to be mindful of when deepening inner growth while promoting IDGs in Japan, particularly in ways that leverage the unique culture and values of the country?
Very important question. And I would say two things. So the first thing is, as you may have heard, there has been a recent controversy about the IDGs. They have been criticized of being too normative, basically defining this interior space that in reality cannot be defined in a rigid way. And so that is a debate that's going on. I'm not going to comment on that specifically. I just want to say two things on that and in regard to your question. The first one is, what is actually true and right about the IDGs and the whole underlying approach? And why is it that I have been in support of that? And that is that, as I said, in regard to your first question, that I think the only way for us to move forward is to focus on the inner dimension of leadership work, not only individually, but also on a collective level. That's really what Theory U does, right? It's a method that is activating the interior space, the inner space of leadership on a systems level, not just on the level of the individual as it's usually done. And so that has a long tradition. It has traditions in a variety of cultures, right, like your own, but then there's also other cultures with indigenous cultures. Even, I would say, I'm coming from Germany, as some of you may know. And in Germany, we have this concept, it comes out of the 19th century, the early 19th century, and late 18th century, the Bildungsbegriff. So the concept of Bildung is basically a holistic learning. It's basically not only cultivation, but it's self-cultivation, right? In a way that's more holistic, right? That's not only focusing on the mind, but also on the heart and the hand, or what in Theory U is referred to as open will. And so that is, for the reasons we mentioned before, absolutely necessary. That is the golden thread of that approach. Now, the way the IDGs have been specified, right? So, and I have said that before, right? So it's okay, we got 17 SDGs that no one can remember ever, right? And now we have 23 new things that we also need to remember. So is that really helping, right? And it's in a way it is using. So here's what it is really, and here's what it does in a positive way. It's explaining something that's non-linear, right? Which is holistic inner development, and really vertical development, which means essentially it is about shifting the mindsets and shifting consciousness. It is explaining that holistic concept, non-linear concept, in a linear way, right? To linear people. So that's a tool that you can use and that can help to mainstream it in institutions. Now, but that's really all it is. So it doesn't tell you how to do it, right? And then, of course, the problem starts, and that's where I would agree with some of the criticisms that I, only have heard about. I haven't really absorbed it in detail. But in principle, I would agree with that you cannot, if you translate that into whatever number of dimensions and key skills and practices, be that 5 or 23, whatever that is, and then you roll it out by basically running training programs for each of them. And then in the end, you say, and now you need to implement that. Now comes the application. You roll it out by basically running training programs for each of them. And then in the end, you say, and now you need to implement that. Now comes the application. That's not the way to do it, because that's basically doing it entirely the wrong way and applying the old paradigm, right? Which is kind of mind and matter are separate from each other, right? It's applying that paradigm to something that is really nonlinear by nature. So what I would argue from the theory U point of view is that you need to do it the other way around. You need to actually not start with trainings and all these skills. You need to start with paying attention to the challenges that we are up against. You need to embed the practice of shifting the inner place from that we operate individually, but also on a collective level. You need to embed that in real life through action learning and action leadership. And that's really the how-to. That's kind of, how do you do it? Well, you need to apply a process, right? And so you need a process, actually. It's not enough to specify the what. You need a process in order to create a holding space where a group with very different interests and people can go through that process. That's really what Theory U does. So I would, when I work in applied situations, I do it the other way around, right? I start with the challenges, and you wrap, so all the knowledge about the IDGs, the inner development capacities, or what in a simplified version, and Theory U is simply called open mind, open heart, open will, right? That's a simplified version of that, which is pretty much, intuitive for practitioners, right? Why do I say that? Because I know it from experience from around the world, right? Across sectors, across cultures. It's not like kind of a Western or Northern concept forced upon others. And so if you create kind of these holding spaces, then the way you do it in different cultures is that you bring in these different cultural contexts. So in other words, the way it shows up, the way it's specified is culturally dependent and also situationally dependent. It may be different things in different situations. And that's where I really very much like your question, because what you basically suggest is, look, yes, there's this concept, but how much, so your intuition to ground that in the specific cultural context you're operating from is exactly right. And so directly now answering your question, how do you do it? So what is my kind of suggestion? I would basically make it, it's kind of balancing two factors. So on the one hand, you want to make it, you need to bring in two dimensions. On the one hand, or you could say perhaps it is like a triangulation of three things, right? On the one hand, you want to make it relevant to the specific cultural context, right? You want to ground the way you bring it in, the way you hold the space in the cultural context you're coming from. And I would suggest to really source relatively freely from that. No, don't be too linear kind of in fitting it into the existing framework necessarily, but take the freedom to really let it emerge kind of from your own cultural context and then link it with whatever makes sense from Theory U or IDG frameworks. And then, secondly, it must be relevant to the current institutional challenges, right? It must be relevant to the current institutional challenges. So in other words, you want to frame it in a way kind of that is really addressing the current institutional and systems crisis and breakdown that we face in pretty much every sector. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it's this: it must be relevant personally. So it must connect really with where you feel not only yourself, but also the people that you are working with, where they find resonance. Because if you score high on the first two dimensions, but it's meaningless for me as a person, it's worth nothing. It only comes into life if it connects with our own interior dimension, with our own resonance, with our own sources of energy, with our own aspirations. So it must be relevant for the key actors that are participating in that. And then I would say of these three criteria is the most important one. So I would say the way to do it, right, in a systems change context is a triangulation between these three things.
Thank you very much for your sharing, Otto.